Hi, everyone. This is Ellie Mahoney with Research America. You're used to me by now. Thanks for joining us. And as always, thanks for being an Alliance member. We have instructions you should see on your screen about typing your questions into chat at any time. We'll save questions by opening the phone and the ones that are in chat until the end of Dr. Gibbons' remarks. But for those dialing in, when we do open the phone lines, I think you still have to press *6 to unmute your line. I have no idea why, but it's in my script, so I'm assuming it's true. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Gary Gibbons. I'm sure you all know him. Dr. Gibbons is the director of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, NHLBI, at NIH. And not only is NHLBI, the third largest institute in NIH, but the research the Institute conducts and supports obviously has tremendous bearing on both the short-term and the longer-term health impacts of COVID and the pandemic's impact on our country and across the globe. So we're so looking forward to hearing your remarks today, Dr. Gibbons, and I'll turn it right over to you. Thanks.
Okay, well, thanks for that introduction. It's my pleasure to be invited to address Research America Alliance meeting. Research America, needless to say, is a fabulous partner. We love the work Mary does with you all and appreciate the tremendous support you provide to NIH and our efforts. And so what I've been asked to do is briefly provide sort of an update of some of the efforts being made, not only at NHLBI, but NIH, to address the pandemic, the global pandemic and public health crisis that our country is facing right now related to COVID-19. And some of those efforts, and as time permits, happy to address questions. I'll give a sort of overview of some of our activities. If I could have the next slide, please. So first, just to give and level set this very learned audience about the challenge that we all face. It's hard to escape the news of what a devastating impact the SARS-CoV-2 virus is having and promoting COVID-19 disease across our country and around the world. And not surprising, as director of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, one of the reasons we are thrust into the vanguard of the effort is because of the effect of this virus on the organ systems that our community and our portfolio deals with on a daily basis. And as you're aware, the virus is spread by respiratory means into the lung, where it induces an injury, and many of the clinical manifestations of that viral pneumonia, of the cough and the fever and the shortness of breath relate to that effect on the lung. Similarly, there is actually data to indicate that the way that the virus obviously gets into our body, it then penetrates the cells of our body, sort of takes up shop and hijacks the machinery of these cells to reproduce itself and create more viruses that then burst out and move to other parts of the tissue and organ and spread throughout the body. Well, the way that it latches on to a cell through a sort of key and lock mechanism, the receptor or that lock is a protein called ACE2, but it's expressed in these tissues, the heart, the lung, and the lining of the blood vessels, the endothelium. And so, not surprisingly, that's where this virus attacks. And it gives us these various clinical manifestations that not only affect the lung, but it actually does attack the heart muscle directly, and it attacks the blood vessels. And indeed, this is why you have undoubtedly heard of people who've had inflammation and injury to their heart, as well as because the lining of the blood vessel is so important in maintaining the balance of blood thinning and blood clotting. We now recognize that COVID-19 produces what's called a coagulopathy. It predisposes an individual to form blood clots in various places, whether it's in your veins, clots that go to your lungs called pulmonary emboli, and then blood clots that can affect the entire body. And so clearly the heart, lung, and blood are dramatically affected by this virus, and unfortunately play a role because of their vital status of the body in the severity of the illness, requiring intensive care units, and unfortunately are often the causes of death. So this is why this is sort of front of mind 24/7 these days, as it affects the entire population. You'll see, excuse me, that this pattern is affecting many of our major centers around the country. Next slide, please. And because of this crisis that's rapidly moving, we've been engaged in a full court press, all hands on deck, rapid response. It basically began in the very first weeks of March, in which we started to pursue this sort of strategic approach in our research strategy that starts with basic science to understand the pathophysiological processes and identify potential targets for new treatments. We've been putting our clinical trial platforms in a posture of testing, particularly host-directed interventions and treatment strategies to really address the uncertainty that clinicians have had in treating this novel virus that no one has ever seen before, and developing evidence that's scientifically sound to really guide treatment and move away from the guesswork that unfortunately was part of the early phases of the pandemic. Similarly, because it affects the blood, we always have our mission to protect the blood safety to supply. And because exposure induces antibodies, those are also a means of detecting the exposure to the virus. We have a program in what we call serosurveillance that tells us what parts of the population have been exposed. And perhaps most importantly, because of those individuals who've been exposed and recovered and have formed a good antibody response to COVID, that actually is the beginnings of a treatment strategy that's blood derived. So the convalescent plasma from those individuals, we're testing that can have benefit, and indeed extracting the antibodies of those who successfully recover may provide, again, another therapeutic that's an adjunct to recombinant or genetically engineered ways of developing antibodies to attack the virus. In addition, our research strategy includes, again, using basic and clinical science to understand the natural history and risk factors for this disease. So we've been engaged in this process of understanding, testing, treating, and practicing medicine all at the same time, all within a sharply condensed period of the last 4 months or so. In addition, at the clinical science part, we're also testing behavioral, social, and community-based interventions to address all the various dimensions of this pandemic. And then finally, the science is driven by data and the analysis of data and biospecimens, and that's an ongoing part of understanding COVID-19 and hopefully preparing us to be more resilient should another pandemic break out with another novel coronavirus. And unfortunately, there's a very good possibility that that may happen as we successfully conquer this one. Next slide, please. And so in brief and at a high level, our research portfolio and strategy really targets the whole clinical spectrum and course of COVID-19, with the notion of understanding it from the beginning to its later stages, and targeting therapeutic strategies that might be preventative, or for those who once contract and become infected by this virus, what we can do to enhance their recovery successfully, keep them out of the hospital, but also recognizing that those who have progressed to the point of hospitalization and develop more severe disease may need even more intensive interventions, and to keep them from progressing into the intensive care unit. And finally, there are those who, even after they successfully recover from their hospitalization, we're learning more and more about this virus, that there are sort of post-infectious sequelae, that coagulopathy, that predisposition of blood clots that I talked about, actually is something that appears to persist after the patient leaves the hospital and long after the virus is no longer being shed and detectable. Nevertheless, the effect of that initial viral injury persists in the blood vessel. And so that then again needs treatment strategies. So even in convalescence and recovery, there's an important element of clinical research. And then finally, we're still not sure of how long recovery really is, and are there long-term effects perhaps of that injury or scar to the lung or injury to the heart occur. And we really won't know that until we study that carefully over the next 12 months or years, in fact, to see what recovery really means. In that regard, we've developed several domains of strategies that span the spectrum from the early symptomatic, asymptomatic, pre-symptomatic stage of passive immunization, where again, using those exogenous, someone else's antibodies, if you will, or genetically engineered monoclonal antibodies to attack the virus, neutralize it, and hopefully prevent it from making the disease progress. And hopefully that can be a strategy to keep people out of the hospital. And we're encouraged that we're launching protocols literally as we speak, and toward that end, developing those strategies that we hope, God permitting, we can bring to bear hopefully this fall. Similarly, we have a number of different strategies to prevent those blood clots that I described that go all the way from pre-hospital, hospitalized, and in the post-convalescent period. And then we also know that the body, the host, responds to this viral infection, and that inflammatory immune defense response to fight the virus sometimes can become so overexuberant that injury is done to those tissues, and that can have clinical impact that's both short-term and long-term. And so modulating that anti-inflammatory immune response is the subject of a number of different trials and a number of different therapeutic targets that we're testing, in addition to antiviral regimens like drugs like remdesivir that you've already undoubtedly heard about, which has been shown to enhance recovery from the virus. Next slide, please. In all those realms, we are trying to understand the disease from beginning to end in a systematic way as part of our mission as a research agency. And just in brief, this has caused us to really re-engineer on the fly how we do research. Again, many of you are aware that we really didn't appreciate the scope of this pandemic in this country probably until about early March. And yet within a week or so of that becoming evident, particularly what was happening in New York City, we were out with our NHLBI community and asking for protocol ideas about what we could do to fight this virus. And that call went out immediately, and literally within 4 weeks of that original call, we were using existing clinical trial infrastructure with an all hands on deck approach to say, okay, let's start executing some well-vetted, carefully thought through protocols to address that. And literally, we went from March with proposals being submitted literally to April, and we were already launching a protocol because we knew, obviously, each day lives are being lost, and we needed to test in the context of all this uncertainty, what works, what doesn't work. And whatever doesn't work, let's put it aside and try something else that's plausible and could work and be safe and effective. So that's what we've been doing systematically since that period of time. And we've been using our existing clinical trial networks in really ways that are unprecedented, literally creating a platform that takes networks that are in the heart space, networks that are in the lung space, networks that are in the blood space, different divisions within our institute, and actually putting them together as to one merged network that we're calling Connects. And where we're adapting what we call master protocols, where we're using all that capacity in a consistent, systematic way to ask and answer questions in a controlled fashion. This is what's critical given this pandemic, where we have to know rigorous and conduct rigorous studies quickly to ask and answer questions quickly. And that takes a different way of doing business. And this unprecedented public health crisis has created some unprecedented ways of doing NIH business, and we've adapted to that. Clearly, one of the other principles that I'll underscore is this coordinated data collection, and also, again, a commitment to ensuring that we maintain the principles of inclusivity and a diverse national sample of research participants, again, leveraging existing assets. Thank you. Next slide. In addition to that clinical trial infrastructure, there's still more that we need to learn about the potential long-term effects, if any, of this infection. And many in this audience know that NHLBI is the home of the well-known Framingham Heart Study of over 70 years. And it is that tradition of longitudinal cohort studies has taught us a lot about how an insult at time A can result in complications years later. And so we will be leveraging these resources to understand what are the effects of COVID-19 exposure now, and because we systematically follow these folks, to see what, if any, could be the long-term implications of that exposure. Next slide, please. And that is, again, in a diverse set of studies and populations across the geographic diversity of our country as well. An additional component of what I've described from the standpoint of the NHLBI fits within a larger Trends NIH portfolio. And so the NHLBI assets are part of a broader set of assets we call active accelerating COVID-19 therapeutic interventions and vaccines. Dr. Collins has called together really, again, an unprecedented public-private partnership to advance COVID-19 research through an integrated strategy that brings, practically the entire ecosystem of stakeholders to the table in partnership. And I'm privileged to serve on the active executive committee along with my colleagues, Dr. Fauci, and obviously co-chaired by Francis Collins, but is also inclusive of leadership from pharma as well as our colleagues at the FDA. And indeed, this is part of a larger leadership group that has included practically every major pharmaceutical company in the world, as well as some nonprofit partners in addition, and a true sort of all of government approach on the federal side. So all of these different elements are coming together in a concerted effort, recognizing that no one entity can address the full scope of this global pandemic, and that it will be more efficient, effective, and speedy in addressing this pandemic if we're all coordinated and no one entity tries to compete to get ahead, and we work together. And it's been amazing to see how we can do this in a coherent way in which pharma each has its own interests, but recognizing that no one entity can capture the entire market, it makes more sense for them all to advance their products along in a systematic way with the same endpoints, with the same yardstick, if you will. And we're hoping that this brings more protection to the greatest number of people around the world. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Toward that end, that's the active framework in which it spans the spectrum of preclinical, clinical, and various domain working groups. Let me shift from the strategy and then end with another couple of topics relevant to COVID-19 and in particular a syndrome that some of you may have been aware of that's affecting children. You undoubtedly have heard the sense that children seem to be somewhat less affected, and if affected or infected by the virus, tend to have a less severe clinical course and a more benign kind of outcome. And so although they're clearly children, unfortunately, sick enough to require hospitalization, and there have been deaths, it is not as prevalent as the adult population. But one syndrome that has emerged is called the multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children, MISC, and that appears to be associated with COVID-19. And this is still a relatively rare phenomenon. At this point, there are probably less than 500, 600 cases in the US to date, though we're still exploring what that true prevalence is. These are children who present with fever and many manifestations of inflammation, often requires hospitalization. These kids get pretty sick. They have multi-system organ involvement. Again, the blood systems and the blood vessels appear to be affected, affecting their predisposition to blood clots. The heart is affected. These kids can have heart failure, have low blood pressure, and there's an exposure history. It's a little bit different and atypical. In some cases, these are children who may have had the original infection some weeks to months prior to this representation with this MISC or MISC presentation, suggesting it's a post-infection, a post-viral sort of syndrome, perhaps one in which a certain child's immune response to the virus has triggered injury to these tissues that then has longer-term sequelae. Indeed, we've seen something like this that was actually called Kawasaki syndrome, that was often thought to be precipitated by a virus that then is characterized by blood vessel injury, and actually can cause little outpouchings or aneurysms of the coronary arteries that can have long-term effects on children. So this COVID-19 pandemic has revealed, perhaps for the first time, evidence of a particular virus giving this sort of syndromic picture, and again, may give us broader insights. And so Dr. Collins has charged me and Dr. Deanna Bianchi from the Child Health Institute to form a trans NIH group to really understand this multi-organ and system inflammatory syndrome in children and see what we can do to understand it, potentially optimize treatment, and hopefully define those at greatest risk. Next slide, please. And finally, I just also want to pull out some other sort of special populations that are affected by this COVID-19 pandemic in the US. We recognize that the pattern and burden has been uneven. And there are certain communities that have borne a disproportionate burden. And in particular, communities of color are those who've had some of the most marked and startling and troubling impact, certainly in the American Indian and certainly in the reservations in particular. African Americans have had higher case rates, higher hospitalizations, higher death rates, as well as Latino community relative to other populations. And you can even see this borne out geographically. Down there in the southeast, those orange-red spots are indicative of counties that have high proportions of African Americans. and they correspond to places that have amongst the highest case rates per population. So clearly, this is a pandemic that has really laid bare some of the racial inequities and social determinants of health elements that are true to other diseases, but seem to be magnified in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. Indeed, this appears to be a convergence of the notion that many of these individuals have comorbidities. Next slide. Such as diabetes and hypertension that predispose these same communities of color to the disease, as well as the notion that many of these individuals and communities of color have greater exposure to the virus. So many more of them are engaged in high exposure service work, bus drivers or grocery stockers or other hospital workers that are non-clinicians, in which they may get exposed, but maybe not have optimal protection from the virus. So this combination of greater exposure, perhaps barriers to access to testing and healthcare, combined with predisposing conditions for severity like diabetes and hypertension, obesity, all collide such that this pandemic has had a devastating effect. And it's really in that same reason that one of the elements of the NIH portfolio relates to rapid acceleration of diagnostic testing in underserved populations, so-called RADx-UP. This is part of a whole portfolio of rapid acceleration of diagnostic testing elements and programs that not only are designed to increase and accelerate the development of new technologies, such as rapid point of care technologies to detect infection, but also ensuring that these new technologies get taken up and disseminated and implemented in the context of underserved population. So this is just one of the initiatives that's underway that we hope starts to address some of these health inequities. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, what I've tried to convey to you is an unprecedented response by our research agency, I think, to an unprecedented public health crisis that has taken on a all hands on deck approach that really promotes this notion of the entire ecosystem working together with patients and communities at the center, where we're working as hard as we can, as fast as we can, to reduce the COVID-19 case fatality rate with the testing and deployment of a safe and effective treatment strategy as soon as we can to save lives that are being lost every day, and characterizing and learning more about this disease. It seems like we learn something new about every month as we engage, such as the multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children and the impact it's having on thromboses and other elements, as well as elucidate the drivers of the COVID-19 health disparities and develop evidence-based strategies to eliminate those COVID-19 inequities, and eventually have a greater understanding of the sequelae of COVID-19 over time and after recovery in ways that will help us build the resilience such that should we have another novel coronavirus, we can be even more effective at addressing the challenge. Next slide, please. So indeed, this all comes down to the NIH fulfilling its mission to turn discovery science in the health of the nation, all communities in this nation. And it depends on a diverse ecosystem that's enabling innovation to combat whatever threatens us in our country. And clearly we appreciate the partnership with Research America in that effort, the critical part of this circle of partners that's a diverse, connected community, collectively creating a healthier future for all our communities. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gibbons. I think we only have you for 1 or 2 minutes more. Do you have time for one question?
Sure.
Absolutely. Then Terry, let me, I have a million, but I'm going to forego. Terry, could you ask one of the questions that have come in?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Dr. Gibbons. Actually, we have a question here from a couple of our members that they want to know more about the behavioral, social, and community-based interventions that you're working on supporting COVID-19. Are they being fast-tracked, or is there any way that we can help? And are they going to be available to help future pandemics as well?
Okay, well, great series of questions. These are things that are under active investigation, literally, and you probably will be hearing something forthcoming. As you might imagine, some of the initial urgency related to the clinical trials and treatment strategies. But as you know, there's ongoing effort in terms of just understanding what is the effect of basically the psychic trauma, the emotional trauma, and its toll of this pandemic that's had on our country, and appreciating that some of that may have a longer term sequelae. Some of you are aware of some of the spikes we're seeing in opioid deaths that are occurring concurrently with this pandemic. And so it's clear that this virus does more than affect the heart and lung and blood. And so we want to appreciate that. Similarly, as the questioner alludes to, I think we want to be sure that as we address health inequities and different communities, that we want to be thoughtful and strategic about addressing barriers, whether related to health beliefs or assessment of risk that you've all seen play out across this country about people taking protective measures such as masks, and how to work through addressing some of those things as a public health practice. So there are a number of questions about how we could more effectively both communicate, empower, enable, understand that are in that domain of the behavioral and social and interventions to protect everyone.
Wow. One more question?
Sure.
Okay. I'm going to just.
Mary knows that I can't say no to her, so I'm at your disposal.
Do you happen to know, with mild cases, whether there has been any evidence internationally or what you're starting to accumulate on the possibility that something like a proclivity to blood clots could be associated even with mild cases, or are you only seeing, the longer term effects so far with more severe cases? What would be are we at a best guess stage right now?
Well, that's again a very insightful, fabulous question. That is something, in fact, that we're about to launch a protocol on this month. So you're very prescient in that question. That can we detect the early signs of whether that virus has attacked the blood vessel and influenced the clotting system at an early stage before someone presents, unfortunately, with blood clots already having migrated to their lungs? Can we prevent that event earlier on, perhaps when they were just mildly symptomatic, but their blood vessel clotting parameters were already changing? So literally, we're launching that protocol this month.
Wow. Well, I think we only had you to 132. It's now 135. So we're so grateful, Dr. Gibbons. This was a fabulous discussion, and hopefully we have access to your slides and can share them. And we're so grateful. You're a wonderful champion for research, and we just appreciate it.
Okay, it's my pleasure. Mary knows where to find me if you guys would like another.
Okay, thank you, and thanks to you all for joining us. I think that's a wrap.
Great, thank you.
Take care.